There was a time when the dream was very simple. Build evasion, let the enemy swing. They miss, and a counterattack makes them regret trying. That was the old evasion fantasy in Wizardry for Daphne. It was not just I to get hit. It was your turn becomes my value. You avoid damage, you save healing, you save resources, and sometimes you even get extra damage out of it. So the older players said things like build evasion or counterattack is good during your A1, A2 phase. It was not random advice. It made sense for the game they were playing at the time. But if you try to bring that same idea deeper into the game now, things get much messier. Enemies get more accurate, more enemies cast spells, status effects become more annoying, some enemies become harder to aim cleanly, and suddenly, the old dream of dodge everything and counter for free stops being a universal answer. So, this video is about one question. What happened to evasion? Did it die? Was it nerfed? Was it overrated? Or did the game around it change? This is my answer. Evasion did not die. It stopped being free. Early on, evasion was a general survival tool, and now it's a specialized build identity. And to understand that, we need to start with why evasion was so strong in the first place. When people say early evasion was overpowered, I mostly agree. But I think the explanation is incomplete. Early evasion was not just strong because dodge good. Early evasion was strong because early Daphne gives player a resource problem. In A1 and A2 when you just start out, your max SP is low, your max MP is low, your skill still costs a lot of meaningful chunk of the SP. Dungeon runs are long enough that you cannot just spend freely every fight. And defense and magic defense are not exactly carrying the defensive system either. So the early game question is not how do I do the maximum possible damage. The early game question is how do I survive from one Harken to the next Harken without suffering. And this is where evasion becomes amazing. Because when an enemy misses, you are not only preventing damage, you are saving HP, you are saving healing MP, you are saving items, you are saving the SP you might have spent trying to rush the fight. And if counterattack triggers on top of that, then the value gets even funnier. The enemy attacks you, fails to damage you, and you get something back. And this is why I think early evasion should be understood as a resource economy, not just a dodge stat, a resource economy. And thus, A1 and A2 were the perfect environment for this. At low levels, every skill used matters more because your SP pool is smaller. A skill costing the same amount of SP feels much more expensive when you're level 10 than when you're level 60. So naturally, early runs lean harder on basic attacks. You are not trying to use your full kit every encounter, you are trying to conserve enough resources to make it through the dungeon. And if basic attacks are carrying your run, then you need a way to survive while doing that. And that is exactly what evasion gives you. It lets you play slowly without bleeding out. It lets you conserve MP because you need fewer heals. It lets you conserve SP because you do not need to end every fight immediately. This is also why sword and shield setups matter so much early on. You don't necessarily need one dedicated tank. You can stack evasion across the front line and make everyone harder to hit. That is a very different kind of defensive strategy. It's not one knight putting cover and telling people to hit me. It's the whole front row saying, good luck hitting any of us. And in early Daphne, when it just launched, that was extremely valuable. Now, to be fair, early Daphne did have counters to evasion. And it's not like A1, A2 had zero mages. You had enemies like the Goblin Mage, Sahuagin Mage, Undead Mage, and other threats that did not care as much about physical dodging. So I don't think the right argument is Dracom added magic later to counter evasion. Magic was already there. The real difference is that early anti-evasion pressure was often isolated. If there's one mage, you could kill the mage first. After that, if the remaining enemies were physical attackers, evasion could go back to doing evasion things. So early counters existed, but the answer was usually simple. Identify the problem enemy, remove it, and then let evasion handle the rest. And that is a key thing that changes later. The third abyss, Garda, is where the old answers start getting less reliable. Evasion is not suddenly useless, it still works, it still has value, but the enemy ecosystem becomes much more messier. You start to see more enemies where just kill the mage first is not enough. For example, succubus and vampires from late A2 onwards are good examples of this kind of pressure. They are not just fragile backline caster that politely wait to be deleted. They can be more annoying to hit, have higher evasion, and more disruptive if left alive from Charm and Spellbind, and more dangerous to your rhythm. Then you have enemies and bosses with accuracy tools, status pressure, charm, confuse, magic or gimmicks that do not simply lose to a high evasion frontline. Cyclops can become more accurate. Doll fights on the Zone 7 can become attrition and status problems. Bosses can use magic, party-wide effects, instant death pressure, or mechanics that do not care whether you are frontline dodges normal attacks. So the issue is not evasion does nothing. The issue is evasion no longer solves the whole encounter, and that is a huge difference. Early on, evasion could carry the whole defensive plan. By the third abyss, evasion is only one layer of the plan. There is another problem too. Some enemies are not only dangerous because of what they do, they are dangerous because they slow down your ability to remove them. This is what I would call damage friction. Undead are the obvious example because they can resist normal damage unless you bring the right tools. Entities feel like another version of that problem. Well, I'm not saying that entities are giant HP walls, they can still be defeated rather quickly. But if enemy resists your normal damage, or requires a more specific answer, or is simply awkward to remove quickly, then the old evasion strategy gets worse. Because remember, the old plan during the early game was dodge physical enemies, kill the mage first, and then safely clean up the rest. But what happens when the problem enemy is harder to remove? What happens when the multiple enemies are applying pressure at once? What happens when killing the threat takes 1 or 2 extra turns? In a dungeon crawler, those extra turns matter. 1 extra turn can mean 1 extra spell, 1 extra status effect, 1 extra heal, 1 extra resource tank. And that matters because evasion's early value was all about saving resources. If later enemies force you to spend more resources anyway, then evasion loses part of what made it so dominant. Then, the fourth abyss, Rockcomb, makes the anti-evasion pressure much more direct. This is where you get enemies and mechanics that feel like they are specifically pushing back against dodge-reliant play. Very accurate enemies. We have Snowbirds, Little Bigfoot, chill and freeze effects that reduce action speed, accuracy and evasion. At that point, the game is not just saying some attacks bypass evasion, it is saying what if your evasion plan itself gets weakened. And that is why I think it is fair to say that Dracom did directly nerf evasion's practical value, just not always through a simple status nerf. They nerf it through encounter design. You will see more accuracy, more magic, more status, more enemies that cannot be removed cleanly, more effects that attack the stats evasion builds rely on. And when that happens, evasion stops being a universal answer once again. It becomes conditional. It works if you invest enough, it works if the content allows it, and it works if your team can support it. But it no longer works as a free solution to everything. Yet again, the enemy design is only half of the story. The player evolves as well. Let's see, the beginning abyss was level 1 to 20, and at the trade waterway, the second abyss is 21 to 40. We have the Garda from 41 to 60, and lastly Rockcomb is from 61 to 70. As the level goes up, your resources goes up as well. And if many skill costs stay constant, then those same skills become cheaper relative to your total SP pool. So later in the game, you can use more skills per journey, and that changes the question the game is asking. When early game asks you, how do I survive while spending as little as possible? The late game asks, how do I kill or control the enemy before they do something awful? And that is where attack and action speed become more attractive. If your team can kill the enemy formation before they act, then evasion matters less. If you do not need to dodge an enemy that never gets a turn anyway. So evasion falls off the two reasons at once. Because 1, enemies become better at punishing it, and 2, players become better at not needing it. You have more SP, more damage, more speed, more ways to end the fight before survival becomes the main problem. So evasion does not become useless, but its original job becomes less important. So normally in most RPG games, if you can't dodge, you will just tank through it. But in Daphne, you can't exactly do that. Defense and magic defense are not strong enough to be a universal answer, because aggro skills are awkward, cover skills are rather expensive and limited, and most defensive tools are only work on certain attack types. And even knights are just being the bots of their permanent skill Knight's defense and very situational. So this is also the case of some certain skills like original Savia's Black Beast Feign becomes very interesting. Because on paper it sounds like a more advanced version of the old dream we talked about. You draw the attack, you avoid the danger, and then you punish the enemy. But if targeting is no longer reliable, and the counter is also not reliable, then it suffers from the same problem as playing defensively. You are spending turns on a plan that the game does not always reward. And then later, Daphne, wasted turns are expensive. So when Evasion stopped being the universal answer, the game did not just change into bring a real tank, it changes into remove the threat before the threat removes you. So Evasion never died to tanking, it just died into tempo. So where does that leave Evasion now? I don't think Evasion is dead, I think Evasion is no longer free. Earlier, Evasion could be a general purpose survival tool. You stack it because it helps you get through long runs, save resources, and basic attacks safely. Now Evasion is more specialized. Sometimes it is incidental. You get some evasion from gear or character stats and it is nice when it works, but you are not depending on it. Sometimes it is a committed build. You stack enough evasion to hit meaningful thresholds and you accept that you are giving up other stats to do it. And sometimes evasion becomes good again because the mode itself brings back the old problem. Heroes of Battlefront is a very good example. When resources management matters again, evasion becomes valuable again. Because avoiding damage means, once again, saving, healing, MP, SP, and taking a saver basic attack turns. In other words, evasion becomes good again when the game asks the old question: how do you survive while spending less? That is the environment where evasion shines, not necessarily when the game asks how fast can you delete the enemy. And thus, this is why I find alternate Debra and alternate Savia very interesting. Because my hypothesis is that these alts are a way to modernize evasion-based identity. Old evasion was very reactive. The enemy attacks, they miss, and you survive. And that is useful. But in modern Daphne, survival alone is not always enough. The game often rewards proactive value, damage control, tempo, resource efficiency. And so if evasion is going to matter as a committed stat, it needs a payoff. And that's why evasion's carrying damage or evasion conversion mechanics make sense as a modern design direction. They do not simply bring back old dodge tanking as an auto-win strategy. Instead, Tracom says if you commit the evasion, your kit should reward that commitment. And that is the difference between evasion as a passive defensive stat and evasion as a real build identity. Old evasion was valuable because enemy failed to hit you. Modern evasion needs to be valuable because your builds turns into something more proactive. So this is my final take. Evasion in Wizardry for Ryan's Daphne did not simply go from OP to terrible. It changed because the game changed. Early on, evasion was powerful because the game made it necessary. Your SP is limited, defense and magic defense are weak, dungeon runs were long, basic attacking safely mattered, and if you have counterattack, it makes the dodge fantasy even more rewarding. And then the ecosystem changed. The enemy has more magic, more status, more accuracy, more resistance friction, and more boss mechanics that did not care about your old plan. At the same time, you as a player has more resource economy. You have more SP, more skills per journey, more attack, more action speed, and more ways to end fights before defense matters. And thus, evasion stopped being the cheapest answer to every survival problem. But it did not disappear. It still matters when resource conservation matters, it still matters when you commit hard enough, and it still matters when a character kit turns evasion into a proactive value. So no, I don't think evasion is dead, I just think evasion stopped being free. Hey there, Alt Savia over here. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have been enjoying the content that I put out. I've been thinking about it for a lot and I just want to get it out there. If you do like my content, please like, comment, and subscribe. I would love to hear what you think about this discussion. And feel free to check me out at Twitch as well on twitch.tv/CountessUrsa. I play Wizardry on the weekends and other games on the weekdays. And well, if you don't want the hassle, feel free to just watch my shorts. Those are my clips of my streams about like what happened during my stream. Anyway, I hope you continue to enjoy having fun in Wizardry for Daphne, and take care. Bye!